Welcome back from what have sounded like lively sessions, concurrent sessions. And let me just say, I so appreciate all of the individuals conveners of those concurrent sessions, and thank them for their willingness to share their work with us, but also their willingness to think outside of the box and consider some new solutions to long problems that we've had around diversity and inclusion. She was not here this morning, and so I wanted to actually recognize someone from our Brown community who's done some remarkable work of documenting the history of African Americans at Brown. And so while we recognized a number of people this morning and last night, I did want to in particular thank two individuals who were instrumental in putting together the work that you've seen on those digital timelines, both here over on that side and also down in Smith-Bonanno in the lobby. So I would like to please have Karen McLaurin and Karen Baxter stand up. Thank you for your work. Thank you for the ongoing work. Phase 2 will begin, right? So today we have, as our luncheon plenary speaker, someone whom I've known for some time. I'm not going to introduce her, but I will introduce the person who is going to introduce her, whom I haven't known for as long a time, but who has been a hero to not just the folks here at Brown and to me personally, but to a true hero in every sense of the word to the academic and medical school community. Dr. Augustus White is a scientist who has distinguished himself on several fronts, most notably in orthopedics. He was the orthopedic surgeon-in-chief at Beth Israel Hospital in Boston for many years. Today, he is the Ellen and Melvin Gordon Distinguished Professor of Medical Education, Professor of Orthopedic Surgery at Harvard Medical School, and Professor Emeritus of the Harvard-MIT Division of Health Sciences and Technology. He is also the former master of the Oliver Wendell Holmes Society at Harvard Medical School. But beyond that, and beyond the many accolades that Dr. White has garnered for his pioneering work in medicine, Gus has been to us here at Brown a true leader in really the work on diversity and inclusion. Many of the programs that we have and that continue to exist here at Brown has been in large part due to the work of Gus and the many other alumni who, many of whom are here today certainly, but who have been here fighting the good fight for many, many years. So please welcome Dr. Augustus White so that he can introduce our keynote plenary speaker.
Good afternoon, my fellow humans. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to introduce Professor Susan Sturm. She is a graduate of Yale Law School and a graduate of Brown University, class of 1976. And I want to talk a little bit about the graduation from Brown University. I want to go back to the charter of Brown University, which says that it wishes to develop and educate its students to discharge the offices of life with usefulness and reputation. And that's such a wonderful, wonderful phrase and description and mission for an educational institution. And I think Brown has done that, is doing that very well. And I think Professor Sturm would be a quintessential example of that particular success as depicted in the Brown Charter. Her life and her work really is a combination of the ability to advance social justice through teaching, through research, through writing, and through lecturing. And it's just what a gift to be able to have your life's work be so substantively engaged in all of these particular areas related to your research and your work and your life in academia. And she just told me that Brown played a part in that. They played a very major part in that. And I think we can all celebrate that, and particularly celebrate her manifestation of those wonderful principles of Brown education. Professor Sturm is the George M. Jafflin Professor of Law and Social Responsibility and the founding director of the Center for Instructional and Social Change, Institutional and Social Change at the Columbia Law School. She has published numerous articles, case studies, and books on the architecture of inclusion. Professor Sturm is the principal investigator for a Ford Foundation grant awarded to the development of the architecture of inclusion in higher education. She has worked with numerous research and educational organizations and networks seeking to build the knowledge and capacity needed to advance full participation and exercise leadership in addressing important problems. She is currently co-chairing a working group on transformative leadership as part of a Ford Foundation founded project on building knowledge for social justice. Her research on strategies for facilitating constructive multiracial interaction and police training is featured on the Race Talks website. She is professor of these particular areas related to social justice. In 2007, she received the Presidential Teaching Award for outstanding teaching at Columbia. I look forward with great enthusiasm to hearing your message for us today, and welcome.
It is such a pleasure to be back here in this capacity. This is my first time speaking at Brown, not as a student. I've been back as an alum. Think about Brown a lot. I've been back to visit my dear mentor, George Morgan. But I really am honored to be here and to be here for this particular occasion. And thanks so much to Lisa for connecting our worlds. As Gus said, I really became my sense of self here at Brown. And I found my voice as a change agent here at Brown. And I learned also what I wanted to become as a teacher and writer and thinker here at Brown. I didn't know it at the time. But I work very closely with George Morgan. I don't know, he's retired, but I just want to put him in the room. He really was part of the development of the new curriculum, and I took courses from him called Possibilities of Social Reconstruction. And I went to his house and had dinner with my colleagues who became my peers and my co-creators of a life of meaning around questions of change. My major was called Vision, Action, and Social Change. And I have to say, I now, this semester, have the great joy of teaching a course, and I couldn't resist. I called it Vision, Action, and Social Change. So, So thank you, Brown. Many things have changed since I was in college and then also in law school. I was trying to think of a single woman professor that I had when I was here. And I couldn't think of one. Is that terrible? And in law school, there were 2 on the entire faculty. And one of them I could not study with because we played 4-hands piano together. I remember being in law school, and I told my students this just this week in one of my classes, feeling a combination of furious and invisible. Furious because I felt so much that the questions I came to law school to address were not being asked, and invisible because nobody called on me, ever. And then when I raised my hand in criminal law to raise the questions of social justice, I got to the point where my criminal law professor stopped calling on me. Now my students, particularly my women students, report having a different experience. They have women who are, and there are enough of us in the law school, it's still not enough, but enough of us that we actually are differentiated from each other. We can be ourselves. We don't have to be the woman. Women are in positions of leadership. We have a woman dean now at the law school, Columbia Law School. And issues of social justice are now infused into the upper level curriculum. And some of the people who teach at the law school even introduce that in courses like civil procedure. But as much as things have changed, many things we thought would have changed have not. And we still have a set of really sustained and angst-filled conversations about the ways in which many people continue to feel themselves as outsiders, as not belonging, as not being valued in the culture, as being questioned at security for, do they really go here? Do they really go to this school? Not being able to check out books without their ID when the person in front of them could, and even having their peers raise these kinds of questions. And having this affect them much more deeply in the way they engage in the environment at the law school. And in other projects that I'm involved in, we see a different kind of challenge. Clearly in undergraduate schools around the country, there are issues of where people are actually finding their home, whether they are finding their home in the disciplines and fields that they came in wanting to pursue. And then even more importantly, in work that I've been doing in the South Bronx in New York, we in this space represent such a small part of the real challenge facing higher education. It's such a stratified and segregated field. So you go to Hostos Community College, where we're doing a bunch of work, and the people there who are going to college didn't have food for 2 days. And there they are in college trying to make a go of it. So we have a long way to go before we realize the vision and aspirations that I thought in 1976 we would be much further along to address. Now, this is not for lack of trying, at least at a place like Brown, and I would say to varying degrees at places like Yale and Columbia, where I've spent my time, and certainly not for lack of trying at a place like Hostos Community College, which was founded to advance access to education for community that was deeply marginalized and really underserved. So why is it so hard, even in places that have set themselves up to try to achieve these goals? So let's see if this works. Did it change? Yes, great. So I think one reason why it's so difficult to make progress in these areas is because these are complex, multi-level challenges that we face. And this visual, I could spend the rest of the day talking to you. I promise I won't. about this particular visual. It's really to help just lay out the multi-level, interdisciplinary, deeply rooted nature of the challenges that lead us to continue to be stuck at a point where we do not yet have the kind of full participation that we seek. And you can see we experience these challenges often at the individual level. And I think all of the disciplines in the room are probably reflected on this multi-level chart, right? The micro-level dynamics of stereotype threat and implicit bias, the issues about whether you can actually find a mentor who's going to go beyond just talking to you and really invest in you and enable you to succeed and thrive even when you stumble. Moving up to whether you have networks that will provide you with access to the social capital, the information, the resources that you need to even know what you need to do next, let alone to move there. Moving up to the incentive structures that really dictate how faculty spend their time and what's valued. And time becomes such a critical challenge in our lives to do anything because we are all so pressed for time that we don't step out of the routines that we know are inadequate to the task of producing the environments that we need. And then moving up the line to the lack of resources, to a highly individualized and commercialized culture that makes a lot of what we do about advancing ourselves rather than advancing the context and communities and people that we are embedded within. So this is hard work. And you look at it and does everyone want to go take a nap right now? Like, this is really challenging. And how can any of us possibly do all of this, particularly from any one spot there? So not only is it complex and hard, but as soon as we start thinking in this way, unless we have some tools and strategies, we will become overwhelmed and exhausted. I also want to suggest that another reason why we are stuck may be because of the ways in which we've been doing this don't work so well anymore. And some of that is because we don't have the available tools we used to have. The courts are certainly not the place that's driving anti-discrimination, let alone equality. And even our public resources, such as the legislatures, have, particularly at the national level, really hard time to become allies in this field. So we don't have those tools. But I want to suggest also that the kind of multi-level problem that we see there does not lend itself to only compliance-oriented type approaches. And I want to also suggest that a diversity and disparities frame, which continues to be necessary. So please, let me just say, I am not saying we don't need that, but that framework is not sufficient to address the multi-level, multi-dimensional natures of the dynamics that are producing continued marginalization, continued under-participation. So why do I say that? First, I want to suggest that a framework, what I mean by a disparities frame is we know often what we do when we look around and we experience ourselves. My own story that I described to you, my students of color, the first generation students, the women in certain fields, experience themselves as not full participants. So what we do is we do a disparities approach. Let's compare women to men's experience. Let's compare people of color to the experience of the majority group. This is very important. Produces a lot of information that tells us how we're doing. But I want to suggest that it's not enough. And I'll talk a little bit about how it needs to be linked, not left behind, but linked. So first of all, I think this approach underspecifies the problem and goals we care about. So often the dynamics that produce women's or the underparticipation of women or the underparticipation of people of color are embedded in a broader set of dynamics that actually you can't even see if you look only at the experience of women or only at the experience of people of color in relation to men. So, for example, many of the worlds that I've lived in and studied have very high perfectionist cultures that are quite adversarial. And the consequence of that is that people who don't feel and have a level of support in those cultures, or who are outliers, find it much more difficult for themselves to be heard and supported. And you could change everything in the world, but as long as you maintain that framework and you don't think about how to create a context in which people can learn and fail and thrive and recover, you're going to reproduce that dynamic. And it's not unique to women or not unique to people of color. It's also people who didn't go to elite undergraduate institutions, people who are in fields that other than the ones that are valued. So if we don't look beyond, not beyond, but look with and beyond the experience of identity groups, we might miss those dynamics that are actually powerfully figuring into their experience. Also, if we think only in disparities or diversity framework, we might overly rely on the causes of a problem and think that if we understand the causes, we know what to do about it. And I don't know how many of you have read articles where you have a very elaborate study of all the dynamics that produce the problem we have, and then you have a paragraph at the end, right, that says, okay, here's what we do, right? So just because we know what caused it doesn't mean we know what will change it. And that sometimes what caused it is in our power to change, but sometimes it isn't, and sometimes it won't work anyway. So for example, coming from an institution that didn't adequately give people an opportunity to have lab sciences in their undergraduate school and coming into graduate school, we know what the cause is, or at least one of the causes, but at least in the short run, we're not going to remake those undergraduate schools, so we need to figure out what to do about it. So understanding the cause is not enough. And often, if we don't deal with the environment, we will not change the dynamics, and we'll end up then really holding the individuals responsible, when in fact both the cause and the mechanism for change lies in the environment. A third challenge is that if we focus only on diversity and disparity, we might not attend to all of these different levels of culture and context. We tend, when we think about issues of race and gender, to focus either on the level of the individual, an individual or a relationship, a wrongdoer, or someone who's experiencing bias, or at the level of society. But all of these middle levels, what organizational theorists call the mezzo level, where you're creating the context where you can get traction for change, often we don't focus on that area. And that's where you really link what happens at the highest policy level and what happens at the level where the rubber hits the road, where people are interacting with each other as they move along this pathway. And finally, I think you hear this, and this traces back to my own history, that if we often have theories that don't, and frameworks that don't adequately think about how change happens. And I want to suggest that we have to connect, not treat separately what we want to achieve and where we want to go and how we're going to get there. We have to link those things. We have to think simultaneously about where we want to go and how we're going to get there, and frame our visions and our goals and our strategies with a deep connection. This is pragmatism, right? This is Dewey, right? With a deep connection to how we're going to get there and the back and forth between where we want to get and how we're going to get there. Now, of course, you might be thinking, as I'm thinking about moving beyond this framework, in the world we're in right now, where there's such a push towards colorblindness, and we're in the post-racial society, that I might be suggesting that we're moving to a universalistic framework. And I just want to make sure to emphasize that that's not the solution either. Just as there are limitations to a focus only on a disparities and diversity approach, there are similarly really significant limitations to moving to a universalist framework where we don't explicitly and self-consciously and intentionally pay attention to the dynamics of race, of gender, of class, and of difference. And I think this is a little bit easier for all of us to see, but if we move to a universalist approach in a world that continues to be organized so powerfully around the dynamics of race, around the dynamics of gender, around the dynamics of socioeconomic status, and sexuality, and disability, and age, and so many other social categories, we will inevitably overlook group marginalization. By definition, the experience of those who are not at the center are not going to be visible unless you look for them. And we will also risk normalizing, treating as the air we breathe, the things that are actually contributing to the dynamics that are producing underparticipation. You know the metaphor that the fish are the ones who don't know they're swimming in the water, right? So those of us who are in the dominant group of a setting are much more likely to take as given and natural the values and the norms, how we measure success, what it looks like to belong. And so if we don't include and focus on the impact on people in different groups, we are likely to normalize the values in the culture that are creating some of the dynamics of underparticipation. If we don't name specifically the experiences of groups that have been marginalized, we will reinforce the distrust and disengagement that makes it really difficult for them to believe that anything we do is going to matter. So if you don't specifically name the dynamics in some way, you make it very difficult to actually engage the full participation of those who we really need to be engaging to achieve full participation. And finally, and I've seen this over and over again in work that I've been doing with formerly incarcerated leaders, that the people who are most directly affected and their engagement is critical to staying attached over the long run when it's hard, when you want to pull away, to being accountable for these kinds of issues. This work is long run, hard work. It's not short-term silver bullet work. And you know, we saw all those levels, right? So who's going to keep us at the table when we get tired, when we want to move on to the next flavor of the month, when it's gotten a little bit too uncomfortable? It's the people who won't walk away because it's really deeply embedded in the communities that they're in and that they care about. And so if we do not focus at the same time on the group identity, we will lose the driver, lose the engine, lose the knowledge that's so critical to achieving meaningful change. So now we've got a dilemma, right? This is what Martha Minow calls the difference dilemma. If we focus explicitly and exclusively in our frame on identity, we may reproduce the dynamics that we're trying to change and misunderstanding how the larger context is creating those dynamics. But if we don't focus on the experience of women and people of color and the full list of groups that are not full participants of our current setting, we will reproduce the dynamics that prevent full participation. So what do we do? And so I want to suggest a need to expand the frame. So, and I have language up here that I've been playing with, but I want to not get fixated on the language, which is pretty unusual for a lawyer. But I want to just put the language out here as a placeholder. This language does not work in every context. I don't claim to have figured this out. This is a shared challenge. But I want to suggest that we nest these concerns about reducing bias and disparities, increasing inclusion and diversity in a larger frame. A frame, and I'm using the language of full participation, which is then situated in the context of institutional citizenship, by which I mean both fully participating in an institution and the institution being a citizen of a larger polity, and then connecting all of that to a challenge that we need to face as a nation, which is around revitalizing our democracy. So what do I mean by full participation? Full participation is, first of all, it is an affirmative goal. So it's not only about what we want to change, it's also about what we want to create. What does an environment look like where people fully participate? We need to name it. We need to know it. We need to have stories that make it clear when it's happening and when it's not. But that's really important, and I think we often let ourselves off the hook by saying we don't like that there are disparities, but that doesn't force us to say, well, what would it look like if everyone really did fully participate? A second feature of this idea is that it's focused on settings. It's focused on contexts. And the context can be any size or scale, but it's not focused on an individual as the responsible or target alone. Of course, we care ultimately about individuals, but we're focused on changing the context in which individuals either succeed and thrive or don't. This full participation idea tries to make this move, this both-and move, of including but not limiting our focus on race by asking the question, what is a context that enables people, whatever their identity, their background, or their institutional position, to thrive, to realize their capabilities, to engage meaningfully in institutional life, and, importantly, to contribute to the flourishing of others. The research I think many of our experience, but my research makes really clear that when people are really thriving is when they are able to have an impact on the environment that they're in. We can actually, one of the most recurring indicators of full participation that I've seen in the research we've been done, whether we're talking about an elite higher ed institution or students who are returning from prison, is the ability to recover from failure. Who is it that can drink, get drunk, get hospitalized, and get counseling, versus drink, get drunk, get hospitalized, and get arrested? And we can just use that as an illustration. So, what does it take to move in this direction of building an architecture of full participation? How can this happen? And I want to just lay out, and then I'll stop for questions, lay out some 5 framing principles. And just to tell you where this comes from, where these framing principles come from. First of all, my writing in the past has really focused on this question of how you build multi-level change, particularly focused actually on the STEM fields, using the NSF Advance as an example. Looking at multidisciplinary scholarship, when you link together social psychology and network theory and organizational cultural analysis and larger kind of ecosystem public health analysis, all of these are kind of pushing in this same direction. So none of this is really particularly original. It's just applying it in a different context. And finally, I've been doing a lot of work with organizations that bring the center in to help use research as a strategy to actually drive institutional change. So this is like breaking the rules on one level. You know, it looks like we have the rule you're not supposed to influence your environment if you're trying to do research to understand how things happen. But my sense is that if you're really interested in the dynamics of change, where you have too many variables to control them, the only way that you can really understand how change happens is to go in, look deeply and rigorously, engage together in experiments, and then see what happens. So that's been a lot of what I've been doing. And so this work comes out, these principles come out of these experiments with institutions that are involved in change. I'm only going to talk about the first 2, but one principle really is to move from only thinking about reducing, I want to make clear also that I'm talking here about contexts that are trying to change institutional cultures. So this is not a theory of everything. We still need the anti-discrimination laws. We still need ways of tackling contexts that don't want to do this, right? So I don't want to be suggesting that this is a theory of change for all contexts and all, but this is, if you're really interested in transformational change that will get at these dynamics, that will enable people from all different backgrounds to succeed. How do we go about that? I would say that's Brown, right? That's Columbia Law School right now. I wouldn't have necessarily said that 5 years ago, but it's Columbia Law School right now. So one idea is to move from just the overarching goal of just reducing disparities or increasing diversity to identifying some kind of shared purpose that's relevant to difference. I'm really struck by your reference in the second half of your book to health disparities and the connection between one's own experience of being a full participant as a physician to the capacity to identify, name, and address disparities in health that should be and are the focus of everyone's concern if we're concerned about health of our communities, right? So that's a good illustration. And many times I've been brought into situations where the problem has been defined initially as we think that people of color are not doing well in our environment, or we can't talk about race, or we are really concerned about whether women are being promoted at the same level as men. And what we've seen is that that's a very important framing, but putting that in the context of a broader goal that is very deeply connected to something central to an organization's mission, so it can't be marginalized, that you can get lots of people to come together around, even if they don't necessarily identify with issues of race, gender, or difference. And that will necessarily invite questioning of the status quo and invite us to try new things. So part of what's interesting about this is it's locating the question of addressing issues of disparity in an affirmative vision and goal and change project where there's already some energy and where there's already some commitment, and that connects deeply to organizational incentives. The second piece of this is this kind of both-and approach to difference, where you're simultaneously asking the question, who is and who is not thriving in relation to the goal that we've articulated? Let's look at that in a systematic way. Let's ask that question. Let's notice the patterns. Let's not presume that we know in advance, but let's let our inquiry take us where it goes. And I've never been in a setting where you ask those questions and gender and race doesn't come up as a really important category. But so does discipline. So does where you went to school. So does whether you're concerned about social justice and you're in a law school that has a much larger corporate culture. Then how do you simultaneously ask about these categories and not frame in them? You're continually asking the question, who is and who is not participating and thriving? Who is and who is not, and why? And how do we understand that, and what do we need to change? And how does that connect to these broader goals that we have? I'll just say the last things quickly, and so we can open this up for questions. There's also a focus not just on the individual level or on the top level, but on all of those levels. And what's really important here is not that anyone can work on all the levels simultaneously, but that there's an intentionality to where you sit in the larger system. So it's a systems frame rather than a systems project. And then you're linking people across those systems. We're not just trying to understand causes, we're also trying to understand the mechanisms that produce the outcomes that we're uncomfortable with. So who has access to information? It's really interesting to see how many sites where these problems manifest themselves are sites where the only way you can get access to information is if you know somebody. And you have to know a certain person, a person who has information and who's really deeply connected. That's a problem for lots of people, and it's particularly a problem for newcomers. So by identifying that and connecting it to an inquiry about who's deeply affected in these different categories, I think we can move on identifying structural ways to change systems. And all of this is driven by a commitment to reflection, a commitment to learning, a commitment to building, I mean, it sounds cliche, right? Learning communities of practice. But that will connect our research and our teaching and our activism and our own institutional citizenship, our deep values, our emotions, our families, to the doing of this work. And it's when we set up those capacities for that kind of reflection built into the work we do that we open up the possibility of these both-and moves. that we open up the possibility of sustaining distributed leadership that's needed over a long period of time. People moving in and out of this really powerful and exhausting work. I'm probably one of the few people I know who gets energy from doing this. Like, I'll never leave it because this is what I dream about at night. But most people don't. Most people don't. So you gotta allow people to move in and out, which means that you need to have groups, cohorts, communities of people who share knowledge and who reward one another. And so that's an institutional design challenge, which I think really improves the quality of the community, not only around these issues, but around what it means to be an academic institution. And I think academic institutions are one of the few places we have now where you can have an open discussion where there is disagreement that isn't being driven by some other agenda, whether it's money or politics or power. I mean, we have all of that in the academy, but we also have the possibility of shaping our own spaces. And let me just end by saying one of the drivers of all of this is this idea of discussability. In many of these contexts that we're dealing with, coming into a situation which is highly polarized around these kinds of issues, and the only people that people talk to about what they really think are the people who think just like them, who look just like them, or who they think looks just like them. Turns out they don't. But one of the core preliminary challenges is to make this stuff discussable. And that in and of itself is a leadership challenge. So that's the final thing that I've learned very deeply from one of my colleagues, Heidi Brooks, who's an organizational psychologist at Yale, actually, is that you have to combine the substantive goals that you want to achieve with the building of our capacity to do this work, the building of our capacity to take risks, to listen, really listen, and to connect, and to believe in the importance of relationships. When we can do all of that together, we see really amazing things happen where you didn't think it could. I'll say I've had the privilege of working with Jean Howard at Columbia when she was leading our diversity initiative, and Jean understood this in her core, and what we saw happen in the time period that she was in a leadership position was so inspiring. And if we can figure out how to sustain leaders like Jean and make that the core of what we all can do as part of our normal work, I think we can really do what we still have to do, which I saw in 1976, and hopefully in 2026 we will see a further shift than we have thus far in that multi-level architecture of full participation. So I welcome your questions and your challenges and your narratives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, any questions?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I had two questions. One, have you found effective ways to motivate those points of leverage that have the power to affect the change that we're interested in? Because a lot of the time we're preaching to the choir, and then you get to the upper levels of maybe the power brokers. How do you connect so they have empathy, so that they understand why it's important, that there is an awareness? Even the education piece becomes daunting for the people in the choir that keep singing over and over and over again. So if you can address that. And then also from the academy, oftentimes we know that we need support systems of safe spaces and communities. And I see in recent years there have been attacks on those spaces as self-segregating, and that kind of reinforces institutional hierarchies, and I think it is a moving toward this post-racial or utopic illusion. And how does that conversation happen where we're not defensive as saying we need these spaces because?
Right.
And those are the two.
Those are great questions, really important questions. So getting people who are, where we're not just preaching to the choir, but particularly the people who are sitting with the levers of power in the places to make change. And you know, what I've seen to really make the difference is it really starts with how you initially frame the issue and the challenge, right? So if you, I'll illustrate in two ways. One, using the STEM fields as an example. Initially, I mean, have any of you ever heard Freeman Hrabowski speak, right? So Freeman Hrabowski is the president of University of Maryland, Baltimore County, has been president there for 20 years. When he first came in, and he was initially provost and then president, he defined the challenge. He saw that particularly black boys, but black students in general were not going into the sciences and were not doing well. You know, they had, you know, basically were at the lower end of the curve. And of course, he was in a leadership position, but he got a lot of pushback from other people when he started a program initially that was focused only on the participation in the STEM fields of initially black boys, and then he opened it up to black boys and girls. It was actually the law that required him to open the program up further to be anyone who was going to advance diversity. But what he saw happened is when he, at the same time that he was doing this work that was focused specifically on race, which was really not engaging any of the people other than the ones who were in that program. They didn't care about, the people who were teaching science and STEM for the most part didn't care particularly about this issue or enough to do anything about it. But at the same time, UMBC was, I mean, these are the way they would describe themselves, a kind of mediocre white commuter institution that couldn't attract any research dollars. And we're really like trying to figure out whether they were going to be able to survive. There was, at the same time that you were having a kind of small community, building a small community that was a safe space, there was a big push to improve interdisciplinary science, to upgrade the spaces that people were doing their work in, to get funding from industry, to make the trains run on time at UMBC, and to do that in a way that simultaneously connected with, and what does this mean for the participation of these students who would increase diversity in our institution? And then there were a set of practices that were developed in this small space that actually worked to the point where at UMBC, if there's a stereotype now from what I've been observed, if you're a black student in the sciences, you're probably one of the A students. That's what's happened at UMBC. So simultaneously having this move that affected everybody, everyone was invested in upgrading the quality of the educational experience. Everyone was invested in interdisciplinarity. And all of those things also affected the participation of students of color. So it was simultaneously identifying an issue that the people in power cared about and setting it up so that they couldn't address the issue without also addressing issues of race, without also addressing issues of gender. Now that of course required leadership, not just at the top, at every level. So, but I think that finding that issue that brings people together around something that lots of people care about. Law schools are in trouble now. We've got to find a way to be relevant, to make the experience one that builds leadership so that people will still want to go to law school. We can get a lot of people who are interested in that issue, and then we can say, and by the way, those same dynamics are making it difficult for students of color and first-generation students to feel like they fully participate. And this connects to your second question, which is, I think that if we articulate what a learning space, what do we mean by a safe space? Like, what does that actually mean? And how does it relate to learning? Why do we need it for people to thrive? And why do we need it for people who feel unsafe in another part of the university? What does that actually look like? And what does that mean, not just for students of color, but what does a safe space mean for everybody? And you know, if we can do a lot more work to name and narrate what that means, I think we're going to be in a stronger position to say, And therefore, we need to have those spaces for students who are in this environment that right now doesn't fully recognize them, and here's why. So I think we need to do more of our homework and be able to tell those stories not only in our own terms, but in terms that will make sense to people who don't get it, you know, directly.
Hi, Susan. I'm David Kim from Connecticut College. First, I've heard you give versions of this talk before, Susan, but I'm impressed yet again by, your capacity to both be a visionary for diversity and participation work, but also to give a pragmatic path, right? I think that's one of the struggles that we constantly tackle, right? We can err towards the pragmatic and give up the vision, and not think about, both together. So I guess I want to ask a question in regard to capacity building, right? And bring this back to your remarks about Dewey and revitalizing democracy, right? Because if you think about revitalizing democracy, it's not as just that outer atmosphere, but a mandate that has to permeate all the spheres. Right. So I'm trying to think about how do we cultivate capacities for not just a revitalized democracy, but a radical democracy, right? Where democratic ways of life are felt at each of those levels, each of those spheres, so that it's not just full participation, but it's the sense in which, one's full presence can participate democratically with others, right? And the question about capacity is, not to confuse the desire for order and procedure as necessarily a democratic practice, by which I mean, one of the things that institutions really struggle with are the transitions, right? As we're transitioning toward better participation, more inclusion, we have very few tolerances or very little capacity to tolerate messiness, right? Real dispute, right? This rush to conclusion and resolution and reconciliation, prior to actually hearing the cacophony. Right, and the kind of questioning of, the claims about the authentic culture that we're trying to denaturalize. So.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I have the real privilege to work with David in an initiative that's called Creating Connections Consortium, which is a cross-institutional initiative to build diversity on the faculty in liberal arts colleges by starting with undergraduates and building programs to get undergraduates interested in graduate education, and forming a partnership with 2 Research One universities to have them transition into graduate school, and then have people in graduate school then understand liberal arts education as something that would be a good place for you as a faculty member, but to also deal with all of the cultural dynamics that are taking place in liberal arts colleges and in research universities that are making it really difficult for students of color and women and lots of people to want to go to graduate school and want to go to a liberal arts college, particularly one located in a very white community. So we're thinking about all of these kinds of questions, and we're thinking about them cross-institutionally, not just within an institution, but thinking cross-institutionally. So how do we build this capacity in a way that is radically democratic? And I hear you saying radical in both the sense of being at every level, but also radical in the sense of being able to really ask the question, how are we setting ourselves up? Are we set up to actually achieve a democratic vision? And do we need to really question the way in which we're setting ourselves up, and how to do that in a way that is not just formally democratic. I think that I have a couple of thoughts about this. One is to look at the spaces where we currently have the opportunity to practice democracy, right? So one of them is a classroom. One of them is meetings. Another one is meetings. Let's just take those 2 spaces, right? So in my own classroom, in a law school, we actually share power. I share power with my students. Now, I don't give over power, we share power. And we share power both by getting input about where they're going to be situated in the work. We share power in how the ground rules go forward with how we conduct our discussion. We share power in developing collectively how we're going to assess ourselves. And then we spend a lot of time going back and forth between like small group interactive discussion where people are responsible for their learning and for sharing with a larger group and coming back to the larger setting. This sounds very ho-hum to people who teach undergraduates in liberal arts colleges. In a law school, this is radical. This is like not done. And it's creating a space for people to think about how they want to reconstruct the classroom space and also change the dynamics of power. Meetings. What if meetings had substantive aims? What if we thought about meetings as part of a process of trying to move somewhere rather than one meeting to the next? I mean, think about all the time we spend in meetings. You know, so like, to me, that's another piece of this, which is to think about the spaces where we currently practice so-called democracy. Of course, we'd have to have a willingness to do this. This is not going to work in a lot of places, but it'll work in some places. And then the last thing I think I just put out there is, I think we need metrics. Everyone's about measuring, right? But I think we need metrics that are not only about our body count. Like, what are metrics of discussability? What are metrics that people are prioritizing issues? What are metrics of capacity to engage with difficult issues in an ongoing way? I mean, I'm just throwing out some examples, but if we can actually collectively come up with what we want to value about what a democratic space looks like and how we want to hold ourselves accountable to those values, then I think we can put this at least on the table. And then, of course, we need a way to who's going to assess that, and how we do that in a way that is simultaneously democratic and will produce outcomes. And that's the other last thing, is that we can't only be about democracy. Like, we can't only be about participation. We have to also be about outcomes and producing what we want and to actually achieve. And some things don't require democracy. Some things someone just needs to decide which side of the street we're going to drive on, right? So, like, being able to differentiate between the things that really need and will benefit from democratic practice and what things really just need to get done.
Can I offer one metric?
Yeah.
The desire or the willingness to come back.
That's a big one.
It's an obvious thing.
Yeah.
You can count.
Yeah.
You can measure.
Absolutely. Lonnie Guinier often said to me, the measure of a good conversation is one you want to continue. So it's really, yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I have a question that builds on some of the comments that we discussed today. I'm the director of the Leadership Alliance. My name is Medeva Gee, and we provide summer research opportunities for students, and a lot of that is a result of funding from the federal government. So we talk a lot about crafting a narrative for the leadership at our institutions, but I'd like to take that one step further to see how we can discuss organizations like the Leadership Alliance and others working at Brown and can have a collective voice and craft a narrative that can go to the leadership in the government to really help impact change and provide opportunities that are really going to make these substantive changes in the country and really support the economic competitiveness that we keep talking about, that we need, that is within our different types of institutions. So it's a big question, but I think it's something we should start discussing, and we'd like to hear from you, your thoughts about that.
Boy, these questions are really terrific, not surprisingly. You're doing the real thing. You've got these really deep and informed questions. So, I mean, when we move up the levels, you're taking us up the levels, right? And so one thing for us all to have in mind, and I think I tell this to my students, is like, what's your level? You know, where do you want to move from? You know, it's hard for us. Some of us are level travelers. Many of us, some of us are really interested in what happens in one-on-one relationships with students. Some of us are really interested in creating the larger environment, the larger policy environment, which requires then thinking cross-organizationally in network ways. So there's, what you're talking about there is what I would, you know, just name what you're describing as an example of an institutional intermediary, such as NSF. NSF is another example of an institutional intermediary, or a leadership alliance. And institutional intermediaries, so you're giving me an opportunity to fill in a couple of the gaps here. So institutional intermediaries sit at the intersection of lots of different institutions and systems. and are in a position then to take the narratives and pool the knowledge and pool the learning, and then also influence discourse on a much higher level. All of these dynamics also apply to those institutional intermediaries, right? And they're all dependent on the existence of another, a group that, which Jean, I always use Jean as an example of an organizational catalyst. People who have influence, who sit at the intersection of a lot of different places and can talk lots of different languages, the language of science. I mean, without knowing you, Gus, I would just venture to say that you probably are a really powerful organizational catalyst, somebody who can speak to scientists who don't think about bias, using science, and put something in the room that would not otherwise be taken seriously, namely issues of implicit bias, and then connect that to science, connect that to policy. So take these institutional intermediaries, you're describing the Leadership Alliance, seems like it's a collection of these organizational catalysts that are situated at very different locations in a system, can come together, pool narratives, do it in a rigorous and systematic way, and then construct opportunities, finding these leverage points for where you can get into the federal government, funding strategies or funding streams, and to do so in a way that won't give up on the agency that each institution needs to have about what the values are, so that you're not letting the values be dictated by the funder, but rather embrace, using the funding as a way to further support what it is that you're doing. So I think you're taking it up a level and giving us a sense of how we can, depending on what location we're at, you're likely to have a thinner impact when you're operating across systems, but it can be deeply informed by the thick narratives and experiences and strategies and mechanisms that are happening for those who are focused at an institutional level or at a departmental level or at a level of relationships. And the key is to create dialogue that goes up and down those levels. Often the policymakers don't have any idea what's going on the ground, right? Put in place something that has all the best intentions, but doesn't actually match. If you have people who are holding down 2 or 3 jobs and they can't afford to go to school full-time, what good does it do to create a bridge program that requires you to be full-time in the summer, right? Nobody's going to participate. Anyone who's spent 5 minutes working with those students would know that. But the policymakers haven't spent 5 minutes talking with the people who spend all their lives talking with those students. So that's the key, I think, is to not only talk to the people who are on your level, and for us to structure ways of interacting so that we have an opportunity to communicate with leadership that's being exercised at all of these different levels.
We'll take one more question over here.
Hello, I'm Mary Grace Almondres. I work here at Brown. I just want to pose an idea for further consideration. And looking at B, 1B, engages the full range of stakeholders needed to achieve the goal. I think a lot of times where executive leaders may miss the mark on B is that social justice is not just a distributive process, it is also contributive. Right? And so engaging is not necessarily the same as giving agency to people to make change in their respective areas in their respective lives. So I think where we miss the mark is not only giving people the agency to value that and to create the infrastructure so we scaffold out the change that requires, that happens over a long period of time. I think a lot of times we just want things to happen now when we point to a particular department or a particular person or position. And that's where our cultural understanding and our cultural values around social justice fail, because it becomes relegated to that particular department or that particular person. So just wanted to also pose the contributive value that individuals and departments can also make in making sure that social justice is infused within the institution.
Yeah, that's, again, really, really important and powerful. And I'm thinking a lot about this Bronx project. We're part of this group that is it's also responsive to the question about funding. The funders are really interested in outcomes, so they will consult with people. You get listened to, you get a voice. A voice means that you have an opportunity to speak with the people who are going to make the decisions, but you're not part of that group. And so we've been basically fighting back, saying, you know what, we won't take your money if you make us work in a time frame and with a decision-making process that doesn't allow us to find the people who are already doing this work, who are already engaged on the ground, and who are the ones who are most directly affected, and have them be deeply involved not only in giving their opinions or telling their experience or being the Exhibit A, but really being very much a part of the process of defining the problem, understanding how people are moving through the system, and really importantly, establishing priorities and figuring out what will work. And if we don't do that, we're going to continue to create systems that we don't even know where our blind spots are and where we won't get the investment. So I mean, that's thinking about that on, I mean, if we think about that in the departmental level, and then we look at I mean, I just can't say enough how important it is that we find ways to bring the people who are not in this room into this conversation. How the people who don't have now a way even in to this conversation. And if we don't figure out how to connect places like Brown and Columbia and Yale, and those my 3 alma maters, to that problem, we're only moving the chairs around on the deck of the ship. So you're saying that with respect to a department, and it's critically important there, and I think we need to do that with respect to the communities in which we sit, and make that as a deep investment, not just civic engagement for our students who are going to have a nice learning experience, but a really deep investment of partnership and resources and shared knowledge development and shared democratic revitalization. And that's really where I think we need to get to.
Thank you very much. So,
Sturm,
go ahead.
thank you so very much for your 5 framing principles. It looks like a very fresh and a different approach, a very different approach. And we look forward to seeing some good outcomes. By the way, if I may, where are you going to look at your outcomes most importantly? There is, what? Sorry. No, I was just thanking Professor Strong for a fresh and invigorating approach, a very different approach of the 5 principles that she's described. And I was just curious as to where she's going to look for the outcomes.
Well, so very concretely, we're going to look in these different projects. So some of them are in elite institutions of higher education, where we're looking at outcomes around faculty full participation or student full participation. And we're also looking for outcomes in the South Bronx. I mean, we want to be held accountable for increasing the participation of formerly incarcerated students, immigrants, veterans, and students who didn't go straight through college to go to college and then graduate and move on. So ultimately, that's what we want to be accountable for. And in the meantime, for democratic practice and have people coming back to the table and really fully engage.
Thank you.
So.
Thank you. Thank you.